repeated himself. There's a bomb in the building. Clear out. What bomb? Who told him? Who knew? Let's try it again. I can...
Bomb in the building, start clearing out. Sorry, you said the bomb?
What'd you say?
Bomb in the building, start clearing out. Got it.
Y'all hear that okay? Enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. Now you can make an argument, and it's a fair one, that gravity itself will cause dust when a structure collapses, such as in an earthquake. But here we have dust that goes to New Jersey. Pools of molten iron. This is the hardest thing I have in my mind to figure out. Pools of molten iron. First of all, most of this building is constructed with structural steel. The rebar on each of the 47 decks are going to be grade 40, grade 60, grade 75. I don't know. I need the construction contract documents to figure that out exactly. But they're going to be one of those three. The structural members are going to be ASTM 836. I know about how much that concrete is going to have in terms of its constituents, carbon, silicone, etc. It's going to be a low carbon, and we designed it that way. It's going to have a tensile strength of about 56,000 psi, and that's why we choose it, because it's soft. It will elongate 23 to 30% before it fails. It's an ideal building material because it's extremely strong, and it's extremely ductile and elastic, and allows for vibrations and so on and so forth. But how do you melt it? What do you mean pools of molten iron, which is steel's an iron derivative, a very low carbon iron, if you will. Steel was refined and developed about 150 years ago, and it's the ultimate building material. How do you melt steel? It's not easy. The oldest way, and that is the development of that technology, goes back to the Hittites, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ. And they figured out early on, using bellows, that they had to introduce a lot of oxygen, or air, the oxygen in air, to heat charcoal, petroleum coke, probably charcoal in that day, to get iron to melt. In a 10-inch cupola furnace, inside diameter of 10 inches, with tweezers 2.5 inches blowing air in, you need approximately 200 cubic feet per minute of air at all times continuously to heat inside a cupola furnace sequential layers of coke and steel, coke, steel, coke, steel. Office fires can't do that. The ignition temperature of most oil products is about 400 degrees, 500 degrees. If you have more air, you have more heat. And our welding cutting torches, acetylene, a very, very flammable gas, will burn at 5,600 degrees. But there's pressurized oxygen feeding the pressurized acetylene. And at the very tip, we get a 5,600 degree burn. But notice, if you've ever welded or cut steel, your burning is very local to the kerf of your welding tip. Right at the end, 5,600 degrees. An inch away, slightly above room temperature. So there's three modes, and I don't want to get into heat transfer theory, but as far as my education, there's three modes. There's radiation, there's convection, and there's conduction. All three modes always play a part in the transfer of heat, but usually there's one predominant mode. But this one blows my mind. How did molten metal or molten steel get in there in the first place? Well, on WTC 1 and 2, there's steel coming out a building showing the videotape evidence, and the steel appears to be bright orange, which molten steel is if you're familiar with foundries. We have one in Jewett, Texas, Nucor Steel, and I have been in there, and I have seen molten steel. It's not this. It's what you see on the videotape. This is molten aluminum. And there's some controversy on molten aluminum versus molten steel in some of the reports of what's coming out of the buildings, WTC 1 and 2. Molten aluminum, silvery. And we do have a foundry in Fort Worth. You can go see what molten aluminum is, or you can just look at it here. It's silvery. Molten steel looks different. It's red. It's orange. It's very bright. Now here's a long litany of different people witnessing molten steel. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel still running. Leslie Robertson, structural engineer, responsible for the design of the WTC at the National Conference of Structural Engineers on October 5, 2001. Is he a credible source? Yes. Oh, yeah. Fires burned and molten metal flowed into the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet, according to New Jersey's Task Force 1 Urban Search and Rescue, Sarah Atlas. What do the first responders and demolition contractors say about molten metal? Well, Peter Tully saw pools of literally molten steel. President of Tully Construction in Flushing, lead contractor for site cleanup. Is that a credible source? Chaplain Herb Tripp, molten metal, beams had just totally been melted. Beams had just totally melted. John O'Toole, a Bronx firefighter, it was dripping from molten steel. Reporter with rare access, steel flowed into molten streams. Allison G-E-Y-H, PhD. They are finding molten steel. A disaster relief veteran seeing molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams. By this time, you should be asking yourself, what on earth could cause molten steel to be there in the first place? Can burning office supplies cause molten steel? Thermite, maybe? Dr. Keith Eaton, ranging from molten metal, red hot, weeks after the event. That's suggesting chemical reaction, not some temporary taking a welding torch and running a cut. This is involving chemicals. Maybe thermite. Maybe. Guy Lonesbury of New York Air National Guard's 109th Air Wing. Molten steel at the heart of the towers remain. Firemen sprayed water to cool the debris, but the heat remained intense, enough at the surface to melt their boots. New York Department of Sanitation spokeswoman. Molten steel beams. Everything from molten steel beams to human remains. For about 2.5 months after the attacks. American author and journalist William Langeweiss. The streams of molten metal that had leaked from the hot cores and flowed down broken walls inside the foundation hole. Boone County firefighter Lee Turner, seeing the darkness, a distant pinkish glow, molten metal dripping from a beam, but found no signs of life. This person, in the first few weeks, sometimes when a worker would pull a steel beam from the wreckage, the end of the beam would be dripping molten steel. I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center. Abul Hassan Astana As, the first structural engineer given access to WTC steel at Fresh Kills landfill.